Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net. Welcome to Windows on the World. This is a follow-up to our very short show on Sunday, which was actually quite dynamic. We did it in a car after one of our talks, The Bigger Picture. And in the Bigger Picture talks, which we are taking around the country, and incidentally you can book one in your local church hall or whatever venue you choose, and we will turn up. And it's very easy to do. Get in touch with us through the website. But yeah, in our series of talks, I describe global management concepts and how these are brought down into local. So in other words, we're talking from the big picture to the very small picture locally, and the control of people, ideas, beliefs, land, and all property. Because this new system that we're under and being mentored into is all about the control of everything. It is the control of people, ideas, all beliefs, land, and all property. Now, I use a comparison in the talks between a papal bull of 1302 called Unum Sanctum and what is happening now under the UN Agenda 2030 Global Action Plan. Unum Sanctum, this papal bull of 1302, made by the Universal Church, was the biggest claim in world history. The world was put into trust to the Universal Church, and it was stated that there'd be no salvation outside the Universal Church. They also stated that every human creature be subservient to the papal authority. Now, the Bible said we had dominion over everything that creepeth on the earth. The Universal Church of Rome, describing us as creatures, took away the inalienable rights granted to us in the Bible, in their system. It's quite interesting, actually, because all this was done on the back of a claim. Now, anybody can make a claim. A claim doesn't have to be valid. A claim is just that. Somebody who comes along and says, I'm making a claim. It doesn't have to be proved to be right or wrong in the first instance, and that's the important thing. A claim should always be challenged. Yeah, the United Nations and UNESCO state no one will be left behind. The group hive mind is the only mind, a collective hive mind with no thoughts or allowed facts of its own. This has been the subject of many of our recent shows. The manufactured consensus on climate change theory is the latest hive mind control system for the entire planet. And what we've seen recently is the use of children to promote the United Nations control system on the back of the lie of anthropological global warming. And in an argument, a real argument, where we would be allowed to debate, we would prove that it was a lie and why, how, and whom, not necessarily in that order, it had been brought in by the United Nations through a series of documents. And it was going to be used as a control system, a control and management system of human resources. And even the people who were involved at the time knew that the global warming idea was just that. It was a coat hanger to hang on the New World System. The New World System hangs on a coat hanger called anthropological global warming. In other words, humans are causing climate change. And the claims have got more and more hysterical. But let's get on to the present. The use of children to promote the United Nations control system on the back of the lie is, yes, I'm going to say it, it's child abuse. The indoctrination has led to children becoming mentally ill, depressed and unstable. Now, this is very useful to the controllers because they're now mentoring another generation into the belief that in order to save the planet, they have to sacrifice themselves, and anything which we would hold dear or inalienable. In the old system, inalienable rights are rights that can't be taken away. We have rights and dominion over the earth. Those were taken away a long time ago, and we were given liberty, which is what sailors get when they go ashore. They're allowed to go ashore under the rules of the sea, under the rules of the jurisdiction that they're under at the time, which is the rule of the sea because they're in a port. All interesting stuff, slightly esoteric, done loads of stuff on this over the years. But this just brings me to an article in the Daily Telegraph. Here's the headline. Parents told not to terrify children over climate change as rising numbers are treated for eco-anxiety. It says rising numbers of children are being treated for eco-anxiety. Experts have said, well, who are the experts for a start? Yeah, psychologists in this case. They warn parents against terrifying their youngsters with talk of climate catastrophe. Now, looking at this from another perspective, or a real perspective of truth, will reveal a lot. So, if parents are indoctrinating their children with this death cult, which has no basis in scientific evidence, why aren't more children being taken into care? If the system worked the way the public think it does, then this would be happening. But it doesn't, because the anthropological global warming lie is useful to the New World system. In fact, it is the main mentoring process of the New World system. So, it's an interesting point of argument. The facts can be laid out to the parents by real experts, and the parents can be retrained and armed with facts and then be allowed to have access to their children again. That would mean that the social services would make sure that the parents were deprogrammed. Wouldn't that be an ideal world? But the return of truth would be welcomed by all those who have been terrified into the death cult of feeling and belief over facts. This is really important. So in other words, once children were released from this fake belief, they would once again start thinking clearly and would have reduced this trauma and be able to get rid of the psychological problem. That would be a solution. It carries on with this article. It says protests by groups such as Extinction Rebellion, the recent fires in the Amazon, and apocalyptic warnings by the teenage activist Greta Thunberg. Now, we've covered this a lot, and Greta Thunberg is not an activist. She's a child who's been given some ideas which she's believed and repeated. She doesn't know anything about science, and she's nearly 17 years old, and she looks like a child. We've already covered this in our shows. So in other words, children are seeing her as a role model because they think she's a child. No, she's a 17-year-old who looks like a child who has been programmed by some very controlling people. So it says, teenage activist Greta Thunberg, the apocalyptic warnings of, have promoted a tsunami of young people seeking help. So, Extinction Rebellion founders know nothing about climate and have misrepresented the IPCC special report. Now, this is extremely important. We're not even going to talk about Greta Thunberg because she hasn't quoted any scientific evidence ever. She's just come out with some slogans to scare people. So, yes, the Extinction Rebellion founders know nothing about climate and have also misrepresented the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Special Report 15, which they base their belief system on. This is very, very important. It was the foundation document of Extinction Rebellion was the SR15, which none of their cult followers seem to be even aware of. This is really important. Go up to somebody who's in the Extinction Rebellion death cult and ask them about the SR15, their foundation document. And you will see lots of blank faces, even more blank faces than usual. But the IPCC author of this SR15 document severely criticised Extinction Rebellion for misrepresenting the document. However, if you now search for this, you only find Extinction Rebellion propaganda and their next die-in dates, basically. So this is interesting because it seems to have been buried on the internet because previously it came up straight away. So This is all part of the hive mind consensus. But the climate change cult lumps together weather events, climate and pollution. 3 different things. The lumping together of these issues is the classic hive mind catastrophizing of the imbecilic and incompetent mind. Very important legal terms. In real and legal terms, imbeciles and incompetents are a ward of the court and property of the state and can never represent their real selves. In other words, they have no rights, only what is granted to them. In this case, by the United Nations Global Action Plan, which is a new form of benefice. In other words, you're going to pay all these taxes to relieve the sin of you being alive and breathing out. It's a great idea for control, and one the Catholic Church used in a very similar fashion with the papal bull Unum Sanctum in 1302. It's a control and management system. And it's also now cradle to grave indoctrination when you've got teachers being trained by the UN to lie to children, to create this child abuse, this climate catastrophophobia, which is going to affect them for the rest of their lives. And when and if they do find out that it's a scam, then you're going to have a population that's going to be quite difficult to control. But don't worry about that, because there's a mass depopulation on the back of this. That's what the UN Global Action Plan is all about, to get the global population down to the global billion, which is talked about in documents that we have covered extensively on previous shows. In the meantime, they're happy with 3 billion, but that's still quite a lot that have got to go. Let's look at the purpose of education now, the real purpose of education, because this ties into how and why this climate catastrophophobia death cult has been allowed to happen. Now, the purpose of education, this is from the Principles of Secondary Education. We did a show called Education Equals Indoctrination. Let's get a few quotes from this book, which was funded by the Rockefellers and written by Alexander Inglis as long ago as 1918. Reduced to its lowest terms, education is the process of producing, directing, and preventing changes in human beings. Would you like me to read that again so you can read this out to your children and break the indoctrination, break the child abuse? This would be really interesting. Quote this to your children before they go to school. Reduced to its lowest terms, education is the process of producing, directing, and preventing changes in human beings. So in other words, it's an indoctrination program. It's nothing to do with expanding the mind or empowering the mind. So, indoctrination into belief system is used to control individuals through society, and it's one of the aims of secondary education, and indeed all education. So, knowledge has to fit into an already existing system and framework. In this case, the United Nations and UNESCO, which is United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, and they state no one will be left behind. The papal bull Unum Sanctum of 1302 states there's no salvation outside the universal church, which is the same thing. We're talking about a consensus, not something that's true. A consensus just means that everybody is made to agree, or everybody is made to appear to agree. So basically what education is about is limiting argument and implanting ideology. So it makes slaves to emotional arguments and implanted beliefs, which is exactly what's going on now in the post-truth world, where belief and feelings are more important than facts, as stated by the useful idiot and now incarcerated, hopefully for quite a long time, Roger Hallam. He actually stated that on a BBC programme, you're not engaging your emotions enough. In other words, once facts are presented, it goes back to an emotional argument with these people because they have childlike minds. Well, let's say the word retarded, which merely means backward. It means they're not able to express themselves in an argument meaning to be able to express logic, grammar and rhetoric. And those in academia, ironically, are the most susceptible to propaganda, which is why the climate change scam is so easily embedded in places of education. Now, let's have a look again at the principles of secondary education, see what it says. This is more from that book. The preparation of the individual as a prospective citizen and cooperating member of society. That's called the social civic aim. The preparation of the individual as a prospective worker and producer. That's the economic and vocational aim. As Henry Ford said, I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers. The preparation of the individual for those activities which, while primarily involving individual action, the utilisation of leisure and the development of personality, are of great importance to society. This is called the individualistic avocational aim. Now, this is where we're talking about what you are allowed to do in your spare time, what you are allowed to think, because every single book that was put into the libraries of Britain and America and around the world in many places was all done through people such as Andrew Carnegie and the Rockefeller Foundations. That's Andrew Carnegie. If you go to many old schools in this country, you'll still see Carnegie's name on there, because Andrew Carnegie was part of the indoctrination education program to produce hive workers. So, using indoctrination into the narrow corridor of accepted opinion, you demonise everything outside through the executive, judicial and administrative branches. This is called the fear factor. So everything outside the accepted corridor of opinion is demonised and shut down through the three branches, the executive, the judicial and the administrative. This is called the fear factor. This stops people thinking. Media and propaganda are the tools, the unelected media in the post-truth world. Sound bites, this is all we get, they equal slogans, and slogans equal propaganda. And then we have the real and the stated goals of every objective, especially in this new world system. We have the real goals, which are control and management of population, and the stated goals, which are let's save the planet by taxing everyone to death and frightening children. And those are the stated goals. But the real goals are world depopulation, global depopulation agenda, and the control and management of all infrastructure on the planet which affects the livelihood of people. And then you've got the benefits. You pay for your carbon footprint. This will make you free of all your imaginary sins because you've paid. You've paid and now you have benefits. The receipt of your payment is yes, you get a carbon credit. You get some electricity to keep you going till the end of the week, because this is where it's all going. This is all about rationing and control of all assets on the planet. So now let's look at the hive mind or groupthink as used to gain group consensus in a cult and basically demonize anything outside of it. So this is how it works. A group of people come to share a particular view or belief without a proper appraisal of the evidence. In other words, it's a belief that's not based on any observable truth or fact, and truth is extremely important. This is what I was saying in that last show we did. When you start going away from truth and you start becoming owned, or your thoughts start becoming owned, or you compromise, or you become politically correct, or you go into any of the other artificial wombs, you start becoming a liar because your inner truth has been corrupted, because you are then susceptible to being part of the hive mind, collectivism. So it says a group of people come together to share a particular view or belief without a proper appraisal of the evidence. In other words, anthropological global warming, there's no evidence for it. And a lot of people will say, yes, there is, but they don't come up with the evidence. They come up with theories. Theories are not fact. The fact is that it's never been proven that carbon dioxide is a forcing agent which causes warming, because this is where it all went wrong for the IPCC. And this is where ClimateGate came in, Phil Jones and the Climate Research Unit in East Anglia. And we have gone over all this. And I've got some more quotes towards the end of the show about this as well, which will be very interesting. But basically, because their belief is ultimately only subjective, resting on shaky foundations, they then defend it only by displaying an irrational, dismissive hostility towards anyone daring to question it. Isn't this just the truth? You either get logical fallacies, which are unsubstantiated arguments. They attack you personally. They attack the person, not the idea, because they can't attack the idea because the idea is based on facts. And then they throw their toys out of the pram and get hysterical. This is because it's a cult and it's a belief, but it has no basis in reality outside the hive mind. But basically, this is bringing us up to a document that came out last year, and it was edited and put together by Christopher Booker, a journalist who is now dead. He died, I think, late last year, early this year. But the point of it is that Booker's put together a very good document which contains pretty much all of the frauds that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have actually put into the public domain. But the actual paper is called Groupthink. Now, groupthink, it says, refers to a deterioration of mental efficiency, reality testing, and moral judgment. And the name groupthink, the term groupthink, was coined by Irving Yannis in his book Victims of Groupthink in 1972. Now, let's go through these 3 rules of groupthink. We've gone into the background of it and the overall picture, but let's now look at the rules, get a bit more focused on it. The 3 rules of groupthink. Rule 1 is that a group of people come to share a common view or belief that in some way is not properly based on reality. They may believe they have all sorts of evidence that confirms that their opinion is right, but their belief cannot ultimately be tested in a way that confirms this beyond doubt. In essence, therefore, it is no more than a shared belief. Rule 2 is that precisely because their shared view cannot be subjected to external proof, they then feel the need to reinforce its authority by elevating it into a consensus. Now, this is interesting because in 1972, this Irving Yannis actually emphasized this word consensus. And this is all we hear these days. This is what these fake protest groups use to gain consensus in their Delphi technique meetings and rallies. Delphi technique is a way of controlling group thought. It's group consensus. They steer you into a predicted outcome. But it says, to those who subscribe to the consensus, the common belief seems intellectually and morally so self-evident that all right-thinking people must agree with it. How could you be outside the group? How can you possibly think that this is not reality? And this is the kind of incredulity that these people who are mentored into this groupthink actually get into. This is exactly how they react. They can't understand why you don't believe it. And that then gets in the way of them looking at the facts because they're unable to look at the facts after that. So, to those who subscribe to the consensus, the common belief seems intellectually and morally so self-evident that all right-thinking people must agree with it. The one thing they cannot afford to allow is that anyone, either within their group or outside it, should question or challenge it. Once established, the essence of the belief system must be defended at all costs. In other words, it's defensiveness. This is all you get from the hive mind, is defensiveness. Rule 3, in some ways the most revealing of all, is a consequence of that insistence that everyone must support the consensus. The views of anyone who fails to share it become wholly unacceptable. There cannot be any possibility of dialogue with them. They must be excluded from any further discussion. At best, they may just be marginalised and ignored. At worst, they must be openly attacked and discredited. Dissent cannot be tolerated. This is what happens to scientists who actually come out into the open and start telling the truth. So I think that's a very good way of introducing what this is about. And that article in The Telegraph adequately sums up what is going on here. Because when we start to look at the whole paradigm of what's going on and children being brainwashed and abused like this, then it's pretty self-evident what is actually going on. Because when we look at the amount of groupthink and the whole foundation of it, and it's based on a lie. So if it's based on a lie, then it has to be defended at all costs. And that's really what this is all about. But what I wanted to do was get on to some quotes. And in the next few shows, I want to especially get onto this because I think it's a really good idea in that we're going to go over some of the real science and the evidence of the fraud of this lie, which is mentoring people into a false reality. Let's first look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is where all of this consensus is coming from. It was formed in 1998. It assumes that the CO2 theory of global warming is indisputable. From the hockey stick graph to the reports using hearsay material from Actavis. Now, this is incredibly important because a lot of people don't realise that people who lobbied for the climate change agenda in the first place were paid to do it. Many thousands were paid at the Rio Earth Summit of 92. 20,000 so-called Actavists were funded by Maurice Strong to go there. So now look at it, we've got George Soros behind it all. So between Soros and the lobbying groups and the NGOs, you have a whole governance system that's pushing this. We've got the corrupted and false data from the IPCC, some of which we'll reveal tonight. We've got the climate models, which have never come true and never will. We have scientists who contributed and now expose the flawed process, who are demonised by the United Nations, IPCC lobbyists, the media and NGOs. Now, this is very interesting. Good example of the fraud. Professor Frederick Seitz, S-E-I-T-Z, former president of the National Academy of Sciences. See what he had to say about the IPCC. If the IPCC is incapable of following its most basic procedures, it would be best to abandon the entire IPCC process, or at least that part that is concerned with the scientific evidence on climate change, and look for more reliable sources of advice on this important question. I have never witnessed a more disturbing corruption of the peer review process than the events which led up to this IPCC report, and I think the one he's talking about is 2007. And none of them have ever come true. This is what we've got to remember. Nothing that the IPCC has ever said has come true. Now, let's now go to Moscow 2004. This was by Alexander Irinov. Mr. Irinov, who was Vladimir Putin's chief economic advisor, and he was speaking of the behaviour of the British delegation at the IPCC, led by Sir David King, at an international conference on global warming. It was in Moscow in 2004. And he stated they revealed an absolute, and I must stress absolute, inability to answer questions. When it became clear that they could not provide a substantive answer to a question, attempts were made to disrupt the seminar. Does this sound like your local council meeting? It's the same template, everybody. It's the template that we talk about in the bigger picture. It's the template I'm talking about here. It's the hive mind. It's groupthink. It's consensus. It's people who've created a false reality and cannot stand the imposition of truth into their fantasy world. He carries on. At least 4 times during the course of the seminar, ugly scenes were staged which prevented the seminar from proceeding normally. As a result, we lost at least 4 hours of working time. This is incredible. This is meant to be scientists. And this is the other point, that the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who the public quote all the time with their 97% of scientists agree, which is a fraud and a nonsense and a lie. They repeat this. They have no idea what the actual evidence is within the belief structure of what they're talking about. In other words, they do not even know that the IPCC is guilty of lies, scientific mismanagement, fraud, and many more things. Let's go now to Professor Paul Reiter, R-E-I-T-E-R. This was his evidence to the House of Lords Committee in 2005. And Mr. Reiter was an airborne and still is airborne diseases and climate change specialist. So he's actually a scientist, but really the whole idea of this was concentrating around this projected rise in malaria and tropical illnesses because of global warming, which obviously wasn't happening. So he said, the issue of consensus is key to understanding the limitations of IPCC pronouncements. Consensus is the stuff of politics, not of science. In the age of information, popular knowledge of scientific information is awash in the tide of misinformation. Alarmist activists operating in well-funded advocacy groups, we know all about those, Extinction Rebellion are the latest ones, have a lead role in creating this misinformation. In many cases, they manipulate public perceptions with emotive and fiercely judgmental scientific pronouncements. Scientists who challenge these alarmists are rarely given priority by the media, and now they are never given priority. They are never given anything in the media, only if the BBC want to humiliate them and selectively edit and change what they're saying, which happens when anybody with anything real to say goes onto the BBC, which is outrageous. And this is what children are being taught. So children are being taught lies, and those lies are corrupting their minds, and psychologists are now saying that those children are mentally ill. They're becoming mentally ill, they're being destabilised, and they are now asking, this was this article in the Telegraph, they're asking their parents to break the bad news to them gently and obviously get on with the recycling in the meantime. It's absolutely absurd. This is from Richard Lindzen, Professor of Meteorology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He said these lobbying groups have budgets of several $1 million and employ about 50,000 people. Their support is highly valued by many political figures. As with any large groups, self-perpetuation becomes a crucial concern. Global warming has become one of the major battle cries in their fundraising efforts. At the same time, the media unquestioningly accept the pronouncements of these groups as objective truth. Now, this is the problem. And that was then, this is now. This is several years ago. Now, for example, IPCC reports use hearsay material from climate activists. They go to blogs, I kid you not. A lot of this stuff about the melting glaciers was withdrawn because it was put into climate change blogs by people who had no proof of what they were talking about and weren't scientists and were basically lying. So this is incredible. It's absolutely incredible. But it goes back to what education is really about. Education is indoctrination. Is indoctrination into climate change a good idea for the people who are running the show? Yes, it is. So basically, they even formed, and this was years ago, another example, a union of concerned scientists. They organised a petition urging the recognition of global warming as potentially the greatest danger faced by mankind. The eventual list of 700 signatories included Nobel Prize winners and many members of the National Academy of Sciences, and it seemed hugely impressive. But Mr. Lindzen found out that only 4 of them were qualified climate scientists. This is another thing. They get people who have a qualification, which could be anybody out there, to be on the IPCC and be an author and part of a working group, and they know nothing about climate. The public don't know this either. But this is really interesting. In March 1989, the main NGOs had formed an umbrella organisation, the Climate Action Network, to coordinate their campaigning on global warming. Can you see how this has gone and how it's been set up? We can, maybe in this show and future shows, go into the background of the lies and the huge back catalogue of lies of the IPCC and the absolute shock of the scientists who discovered these lies. But it says here, this Climate Action Network, which is controlling the narrative and is behind a lot of these fake protest groups. Well, look at Reclaim the Power, look at Friends of the Earth, look at Greenpeace, look at Climate Action Network. Yeah, just look at them. because I've found that they are part of this funding of all these NGOs, just like it says here. Just look them up and see what they're connected with. This is an umbrella organisation that was formed in 1989. So look at the momentum it's got now with all that money behind it. But it says this shadowy body was to be used by Maurice Strong in 1992, who came out of the oil industry. I love the way that they say you must be funded by the oil industry and you're pushing fossil fuels, when it was actually a billionaire from the oil industry who made his money in the oil industry who funded the climate change agenda in the first place. And you tell that to the public and they won't believe you. They'll tell you it's a conspiracy theory because guess what? They've been to school as well. But this shadowy body was to be used by Strong in 1992 to coordinate his recruiting of the 20,000 activists who attended his Rio summit. This is incredible, isn't it? Isn't it incredible? Remember that Al Gore, the prophet of doom, prophet, P-R-O-F-I-T, of doom, said we should replace employment taxes with a pollution tax system, principally CO2. I really believe that would help our economy and our competitiveness. That was his testimony to the congressional meeting there in March 21st, 2007. Now, if all this is getting a bit heavy, I think it might be time to go to our favourites, yes, Sir David Attenborough, and the sister of the greatest climate change activist ever, yes, the greatest yachtswoman in the world, the woman who is telling us and our children that our houses are on fire, yes, Greta Thunberg, the sister of the climate social justice activist warrior, Greta. Let's go over and see what David Attenborough has got to say in Climate Matters this week.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. Climate emergency. I know it's turned out nice again, but worse is to come. Welcome to Climate Matters with me, Sir David Attenborough. That's Sir to you, yes, and me, David Attenborough. This week I'm looking at the sixth mass extinction and the decline of indigenous species around the world. The fate of many species compared to that of lemmings running blindly off a cliff to their own destruction. Yes, just like the lemmings, many species are running off that cliff to their own extinction.
David! It's me, Greta Thunderbird, sister of your favourite globalist glove puppet, Greta Thunderbird. You better stop lying, you know.
And the fate of the lemmings as they ran
That
across.
Lemmings documentary was a pack of lies. Lemmings don't commit mass suicide by running off cliffs. When Disney made that documentary, they couldn't believe how boring lemmings were. They are even more boring than you, so they made up a story about lemmings running off the cliff. The film crew pushed them over and filmed it. It was a lie, David, a big, fat, profitable lie, like your climate change, the facts documentary, which is also a proven pack of lies, with no facts.
My producer is asking me to carry on, despite the interjections from the little-known sister of the greatest climate activist that ever lived, Saint Greta the Great Thunderbird of Sweden, now a world-class yachtswoman braving the seas.
No, she isn't. She has a crew, a cook and a stylist with her, and I'm not little known anymore, David. I'm stalking your lies every week, and it won't stop until I get a school strike. All those kids are going to sit outside their schools until you disappear from the TV and get lost forever.
And so the sixth mass extinction has seen the demise of most of the Arctic, the walrus, and of course the polar ice.
The ice comes and goes. The walrus were scared by your camera crew. You lie more than Greta.
We face irreversible damage to the natural world and the collapse of our societies, but there is still hope, if dramatic action is taken to limit the effects over the next decade.
You moron! Mitigation for the non-event that will not happen anytime soon, but we got to pay for it with carbon taxes. The only thing that threatens our societies are globalist stooges like you on the World Bank.
In the 20 years since I first started talking about the impact of climate change on our world, conditions have changed far faster than I could ever have imagined.
Yes, you imagined it, like my sister can see carbon dioxide. Wait until the schools go on strike, until you are removed from all media. Wait until the climate emergency is cancelled.
The catastrophic effects of global warming have ravaged the polar ice and threaten the stability of everything we hold dear. Our planet, Mother Earth, our home.
Right, I'm getting a yacht like Greta, and I'm going to follow you to the ends of the earth. I'm going to take over your show and tell the truth.
If we act in time, we can surely avoid this catastrophic collapse. See you all next week on Climate Matters.
Yes, see you all next week on Climate Matters with me, Greta Thunderbird. That's good night from me, the new host of Climate Matters.
And good night from her and me, Sir David Actoball.
Oh, give it a rest.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
What a great idea that would be, to get a proper school strike going. Maybe the children could sit outside the BBC until the liar and scriptreader and actor David Actoball resigns. That would be a very worthwhile school strike. So I'm really behind what Greta Thunderbird's doing, and I hope she takes over Climate Matters. She seems to be doing a very good job. So why don't the public start educating their children to go and sit outside the BBC, the United Nations headquarters, and get them to tell the truth, to act now? That would be good, wouldn't it? Let's get back to the IPCC for some more of their lies. The scandal, which erupted in 1996 following the publication of the IPCC's second assessment report. So we're going back a long way with this fraud. But although on this occasion it had been decided to issue the summary for policymakers sometime before the release of the full report. Now, this summary for policymakers usually comes out after the report now, and it's a kind of condensed version of what they say. I've read most of these reports. I think I've read all of them, and all of the summary documents anyway. And nothing that's in these summary documents has ever come true. We have to remember that these children are being scared to death on the back of something that the IPCC say may happen. And Extinction Rebellion have now said we've got 12 years. Well, the IPCC actually don't say that. They say we've got 12 years to mitigate. Now, this is all a con as well, of course, because the money is in the mitigation. The money is in the benefits too, that the children are going to be paying back for their entire lives. So it was also saying in this article in the Telegraph that it was scaring children from going to university. Well, the university fees should scare them, and the actual lack of employment after university should scare them. But I don't think it's climate that should be scaring them. So my view is that people should educate themselves. The only education that really matters is what you learn once you leave the education and indoctrination system. That's my opinion. And it's also been my route to where I am now. And I would recommend it because the actual revelation of looking into the system and being able to put it down as a management concept and look at it properly without being completely brainwashed is, ladies and gentlemen, it's great. So it says here, one sentence in this report, this was the IPCC second assessment report, it caught headlines worldwide. And it claimed that the balance of evidence suggests that there is a discernible human influence on global climate. And the source for this was basically Chapter 8 of the Working Group 1 report. This was the alleged source of it. Remember, this made it into headlines all over the world and really kick-started a lot of the fraud. Sure enough, when the full report did finally appear, a similar sentence was discovered, buried away in the hundreds of pages, but no one was more surprised by this than several of the scientific contributors to those pages, who had earlier signed off the text as an accurate record of what they had agreed. These now much quoted words had not appeared in the draft they formally approved at a meeting in Madrid in November 1995. So in other words, it was added afterwards, so they signed it off, and this has been added, that humans may have an impact on climate change. So in other words, it's just been thrown in there as an absolute flat-out lie and repeated by the media as though it's true. Now, this meeting in Madrid, where everything had been approved, was attended by 177 government delegates from 96 countries and 14 NGO representatives. 25 particularly odd. 25 was that the only source cited for the new wording were two papers co-authored by one of the lead authors on this part of the report. He was a scientist employed by the US government named Ben Santa. Now, this was in clear breach of one of the IPCC's strictest rules. These two cited papers had not even yet been published. It's incredible, isn't it? People don't know this. The public don't know the absolute lies, incompetence and inaccuracies that have come out of this. And nobody has so far been able to supply that paper that proves that CO2 forcing causes global warming. It's a theory never proven. This is incredibly important because these arguments are things that will save your children, ladies and gentlemen. But he carries on. What astonished the scientists even more, however, was to discover that no less than 15 key statements from their agreed text had been deleted. So this is beyond cherry-picking data, which is what they accuse people who they label climate deniers of. This is absolute lies. It's incredible. And each of these had expressed serious doubt over the human contribution to global warming. And all of these key statements from the scientists had been deleted. They included, for instance, such statements as, none of the studies cited above has shown clear evidence that we can attribute the observed changes to the specific cause of increases in greenhouse gas, and no study to date has positively attributed all or part of the climate change observed to man-made causes. I wonder why they left this out. This all seems so irregular that a week after the full report appeared, the Wall Street Journal published a devastating article headed Major Deception on Global Warming by one of the most respected scientists in America, a man that we've just quoted, Professor Frederick Seitz, a former president of the National Academy of Sciences. Seitz quoted some of the 15 pages that had been so damningly deleted, thundering that, in my more than 60 years as a member of the American scientific community, including service as president of both the National Academy of Sciences and the American Physical Society, I have never witnessed a more disturbing corruption of the peer review process than the events which led up to this IPCC report. The major responsibility for what had happened, he suggested, must lie with the lead author, Santa. IPCC reports, Setzer observed, are often called the consensus view. There we go again, the consensus view. But if they were led to carbon taxes and restraints on economic growth, or if they were to lead to carbon taxes and restraints on economic growth, they will have a major and almost certainly destructive effect on the economies of the world. That's a broader quote of that paragraph that we paraphrased earlier on. Now, it says here, whatever the intent was of those who made these significant changes, their effect is to deceive policymakers and the public into believing that scientific evidence shows human activities are causing global warming. So there you go. It doesn't get any more plainer than that, really. The IPCC establishment was clearly very shaken at having been caught out like this. So unimpeachable was Seitz's reputation that his article could not simply be ignored, nor was it possible to discredit him personally, although that limp effort was made to associate him with Fred Singer as a co-author of a paper, which it was insinuated must have been funded by allies of the tobacco industry. Here we go. They only have a few lines of attack. Why don't we teach children these few lines of attack? Why don't we teach the children in primary school what logical fallacies are? In other words, I suppose you think that Elvis is alive and well and living in Margate if you think that the anthropological global warming scam is a con. These are the sort of arguments that they're going to be taught later in life, which will remove their brains from their existence. They will be part of a group mind hive, which is where everything is heading. But let's carry on with this, because they've now tried to associate Mr. Seitz with someone called Fred Singer. And also, Mr. Singer was very, very derided by the IPCC and the media. Now, this is what happens to these scientists. They do not understand why they are being attacked for telling the truth, and it has a devastating effect on them. And most of the scientists that actually do come out and say things are by then retired, because their whole lives have relied on funding from the very bodies that are telling them to lie now. And this is a huge problem for science. However, it says it began in 1995 with a famous email from one of the little group of scientists at the heart of the IPCC, Jonathan Overpeck, to another scientist whom he assumed agreed with the consensus. In it, Overpeck said, "We have to get rid of the medieval warm period." Now, this is, of course, what led to ClimateGate. 4 years later, bang on cue, there appeared in Nature magazine a graph produced by a hitherto unknown young PhD, Michael Mann, who is now attacking Tony Heller, a climate scientist who's actually debunked everything that Michael Mann has said. So what Mann has done now is tried to get Mr. Heller banned from Twitter, and he's tried to deride him using logical fallacies and the usual "I'm very tired" ad hominem attacks. So this was their young PhD then, Michael Mann, hockey stick graph fraudster, which supplied just what was needed. Mann and two colleagues had wholly rewritten the accepted picture of historic world temperatures. Their graph showed temperatures having steadily declined over the past millennium in an almost unwavering downward line, until suddenly, in the late 20th century, they dramatically spiked upwards to by far their highest level in 1,000 years, thus giving the graph the shape of the handle and blade of the hockey stick. The medieval warm period had completely disappeared, so had the 4 centuries-long Little Ice Age, and it further helped that 1998 had been measured as the hottest year since modern temperature records began, bringing the graph to its suitably terrifying climax. Read that to your kids on the way to school. Well, that's what the IPCC would like you to do. And of course, the globalists. This was everything those at the top of the IPCC could have wanted. When its third assessment report appeared in 2001, the hockey stick not only led the first page of the summary for policymakers, but at the launch of the report, Houghton appeared to the media in front of a huge blow-up of Michael Mann's graph. This is John Houghton, another IPCC stooge. It also appeared 5 more times in the report itself, but almost the only trees from the sample which actually had a hockey stick shape had been the one group of bristlecone pines in California. So they took one region and they used it globally. Yet Mann's algorithm had given these 390 times more weight than a tree ring sample from Arkansas, which had failed to show a hockey stick shape. Finally, and even more oddly, the temperatures for the closing decades of the 20th century were not based on tree ring proxies at all. They were thermometer-recorded data, and in the much publicised version of the graph publicised in the IPCC's 2001 report, they had been sliced onto the end of the tree ring data. It was only this combination of 2 wholly different data sources which gave the graph that final eye-catching uptick. Initially, McIntyre and McKittrick had great difficulty in getting any scientific journal to publish their findings. Now, basically, it goes on and on and on. But he says we later learned from the ClimateGate emails leaked in 2009 from the Climate Research Unit. This is the place in East Anglia, which is where the data sets go for the United Nations IPCC. These ClimateGate emails leaked in 2009 from the CRU. Just what angst and anger this had aroused amongst the same intimately connected group of scientists who were now at the heart of the IPCC. In the exchanges of emails, all their names were there. Mann himself, Ben Santa, Tom Wigley, Stephen Schneider, Jonathan Overpeck, Kevin Trenberth and Gavin Schmidt, who was Hansen's number 2 at GISS and in charge of one of the 2 main global surface temperature records. That's where they come out of, the Hadley Research Centre and GISS, GISS. So basically, at East Anglia itself, their close ally, Climate Research Unit Director Phil Jones, was responsible for the other surface records. So the whole thing was an inside job, literally. What these emails also brought to light was that just when Mann had been creating his hockey stick Jones' CRU colleague Keith Briffa had already been trying to produce a remarkably similar graph, also based on the tree ring proxies, this time from Siberia. But this had also frustratingly seemed to show a marked falling off of temperatures in the second half of the 20th century, which is where we are now, which showed that they were not proxies for temperature at all. It was this problem that led to the most quoted of all, the ClimateGate emails describing how they had used Mike's nature trick to hide the decline. In other words, they had cut off the tree ring sequences just where it wasn't giving the picture they wanted, and then, like man, incorporated thermometer temperatures for recent decades, making them look much warmer than the medieval era. Now, this is incredible, isn't it? And I think we're going to go into more of this in the weeks to come. But if we actually look at the agenda behind the climate change and what really drives it, we can quote Professor Chris Folland, Hadley Centre for Research, Climate Prediction and Research. This is the Climate Research Unit. He actually stated the data doesn't matter. We're not basing our recommendations on the data. We're basing them on the climate models which are made up, complete fantasy and have never come true. They're based on collated data, but they cherry pick the data to get the result they want. This is how it works. This is how consensus works. Dr. David Frame, a climate modeller at Oxford University, said the models are convenient fictions that provide something very useful. Yes, and now we've talked about ClimateGate and the famous incriminating quotes already. Basically, unscrupulous manipulation of highly significant temperature data. And this was the quote from Phil Jones, who we've just talked about. I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding the real temperatures to each series for the last 20 years and from 1961 for Keith's information to hide the decline. So that was a direct quote in the emails that were leaked, to hide the decline. So basically, they were actively preventing genuine scientific debate. I can't see either of these papers being the next IPCC report. Kevin and I will keep them out somehow, even if we have to redefine what the peer review literature is. Can you believe this? Can you believe that people would be this dishonest? Let's have a few more quotes. This is from Timothy Worth, who's president of the UN Foundation. We've got to ride this global warming issue, even if the theory of global warming is wrong. We will be doing the right thing in terms of economic and environmental policy. Now, this is what it's all about. It's about economic and environmental policy, not the environment. This is the most important thing, and this is what children should be taught in school. But we live in a post-truth world where climate change, child abuse, and climate catastrophophobia is being implanted in the young to mentally enfeeble them, destabilise them, and basically make them suicidal. This is what this article in The Telegraph was talking about. And we're talking about a psychological operation on your children. So, I've had people calling me and getting very concerned about this for several weeks, so I thought I'd do a series of shows on it. This will be the first. And those concerned parents who have a brain cell or two left are being marginalised and shut out, and they are at the end of their tether. So I suggest that people get together and we produce a document which can be taken into schools, given to NGOs and charities who are supporting this, and be told that it is a crime against humanity. The global warming hoax is a crime against humanity. And I'm not exaggerating, because it's the biggest crime against humanity in the last... let's see. Go back to the beginning of the show. It's the biggest claim and crime since Unam Sanctum Papal Bull of 1302, which put the whole world in trust to the universal church until a higher power comes back. Well, that higher power, ladies and gentlemen, is the truth. And the truth is within you. The lie is all around you. So you know what to do. Basically, this whole thing about consensus is where it's at. To get out of the hive mind is the most important thing. And the United Nations IPCC is guilty of child abuse and fraud. Literally child abuse, actually, because if you look at the history of the UN, their operatives have a history of, in reality, actually abusing children, and now they're doing it mentally. So I'm not overstating that. It's basically how it is. A quote from Václav Klaus, who was president of the Czech Republic, to finish off. He said, "Man-made global warming is a hoax that threatens our future and the future of our children. Environmentalism is the new communism, but we're talking about something much bigger than communism. We're talking about a new world system. We're talking about a global management system, which is the control and management of everything in the world. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, according to the UN, you are property." So more to come on this in weeks to come. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on Sunday. Windows on the World, 9 p.m. Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday, 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net.